The stones are here. The wind moves across the podium, cool and slow, the way wind moves in a high valley just past midnight. Somewhere above, the stars over the Bekaa are unusually clear tonight, and at your feet, half buried in 2,000 years of drifted limestone dust, 3 blocks of stone are resting where no one can fully explain how they got there. 3 blocks. Each one is the length of a 6-story building lying on its side. Each one weighs somewhere between 750 and 1,000 tons. Together, the combined weight of the Statue of Liberty, her granite pedestal, and both anchor blocks of the Brooklyn Bridge, sitting, exactly, one on top of the other, in the foundation of a Roman temple. And about 800 meters from here, in a quarry cut into the side of the same hill, there is another block, larger, still half attached to the bedrock. The stone was named, sometime in the last few centuries, Hajar el-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman. 1,650 tons, roughly the weight of 330 adult elephants, lying on their side in the Lebanese sun, half-cut, abandoned, waiting for people who, as far as we can tell, never came back. Tonight, we are not going near ancient aliens. We are going somewhere stranger and more human. Before we begin, I know how you got here. Right now, someone is listening from Beirut, just past midnight, the wind coming down off the mountains. Someone in London at 10 in the evening, the kettle already cold. Someone in San Francisco at 2 in the afternoon, pretending to work. Tell me where you are and what time. I read them all. And if you're listening to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. So, dim the lights, turn on a fan, if you have one, settle in, get comfortable. There is no rush tonight. Over the next few hours, we are going to do 4 things, slowly. We are going to stand in this place and understand where we are and why. For 5,000 years, people kept coming back. We are going to walk the length of those 3 giant blocks and learn what they are and what they are not. We are going to walk up the hill to the quarry and stand with our hands on a stone the weight of a small mountain, a stone that was cut and almost moved and then left. And we are going to meet some of the people, named and unnamed, who tried. But before we can understand the stones, we have to understand the valley they are sitting in. So let's begin where any long journey begins, with the ground under our feet and the name of the place. Here's the thing about the Bekaa Valley. It is not, at first glance, the obvious location for one of the grandest sanctuaries in the ancient world. It is not on the Mediterranean coast. It is not at the mouth of a great river. It is not at the border of an empire. It is, instead, and this is the whole story, exactly in the middle of everything. Imagine 2 parallel mountain ranges running north and south, roughly 120 kilometers long. To the west, the Mount Lebanon range, cedars, limestone, cold at the top, warm at the foot. To the east, the Anti-Lebanon range, drier, older, leading further east into the Syrian desert. Between them, a long, narrow trough of fertile land, about 1,000 meters above sea level, the Bekaa, a natural highway. For 5,000 years, anyone walking from the coast of the Levant to the plains of inland Syria has walked through this valley, because any other route involves climbing a mountain, and right in the middle, roughly where a caravan would naturally stop for water, is the town we now call Baalbek. The name itself is a record, Baalbek, from the older Semitic languages spoken in this valley long before Rome arrived. Baal means lord, or master, or, depending on the context, a specific storm and rain god worshipped across the Canaanite world. Bek is harder. It might mean valley, it might mean town, it might mean something closer to domain. Put it together gently, and you get something like the domain of the Lord, or the place that belongs to Baal. Either way, this was, from the beginning, a sacred place. Not a town that became sacred, a sanctuary that grew a town around it. Then the Greeks came, or rather, Greek became the language of power across this region after Alexander, in the 4th century before our era. And the Greeks did what empires always do, they renamed things. Baal was the storm god. The Greeks knew a storm god too, and they had a sun god and a sky god. And over the centuries, those identities blurred together in this valley into a single, solar, thunderous figure. They called the town Heliopolis, the city of the Sunday. Then the Romans came. They kept the Greek name, Heliopolis, and they built, in this small Lebanese valley, one of the largest temple complexes in the entire empire. For 3 centuries, this place was called Heliopolis in every imperial document, on every inscription, on every coin. And then slowly, across the 7th and 8th centuries, as Arab armies and Arab administration arrived, the old name drifted back. Heliopolis faded. Baalbek returned. The sun god gave way, on paper at least, to the older name of the older god, not because anyone decided, but because the people who actually lived here had always called it Baalbek. In the valley, at home, in the marketplace, in the dark, the Greek and Roman name had been the formal name, the administrative name, the tax rolls name. The Semitic name had been the one people actually used when they spoke of going home. Names are rarely just labels. They are records of who won, and who lost, and who refused, quietly to entirely disappear. So why here? Why this specific spot in this specific valley? Why not further north, where the Orontes River begins? Why not further south, where the road from Damascus crosses into the Lebanon range? There are 3 reasons. The first is the one every ancient city has: water. Just north of the town, out of the limestone itself, rises a spring. A reliable, year-round, substantial spring. We will come back to that spring in a few minutes because it is, in a quiet way, the single most important fact about Baalbek. Without that spring, none of what follows happens. With it, everything is inevitable. The second reason is crossroads. The Bekaa runs north-south, but several smaller routes cross the valley east-west through mountain passes, down to the Phoenician coast, or up into the interior plateau. Baalbek sits roughly at one of those crossings. In antiquity, where roads cross, markets appear. Where markets appear, people settle. Where people settle, if there is also water, the gods move in. The third reason is sky, and this one is harder to explain, but it is real. The Bekaa, at this altitude, has a particular quality of light. The air is dry. The mountains frame the sky on 2 sides. The sun rises cleanly above the anti-Lebanon to the east, and sets cleanly behind Mount Lebanon to the west. For ancient cultures that read the sky the way we read the news, a place with this much clean sky was a place where the gods were easier to see. Spring, crossroads, sky. Put the 3 together and, for anyone living in the ancient Near East, you do not have a town, you have a sanctuary. And the town is simply the thing that grows around the sanctuary, slowly, over generations, like moss on a stone. Archaeologists sometimes use the word palimpsest to describe places like this. A palimpsest is a manuscript that has been written on, scraped clean, and written on again, but the earlier writing never fully disappears. A good eye, a good light, can still read the older words underneath. Baalbek is a palimpsest, Baal written first. Then, over the top, in different ink, in different handwriting, Jupiter. Then, scraped partly away, written over again Constantine, Christ, Basilica. Then scraped again Kala, Fortress, Umayyad, Ottoman. And underneath it all, if you know where to look, the oldest name, the one the farmers always used, the domain of the Lord. We are going to spend the next few hours reading that manuscript, layer by layer, slowly, in no particular hurry. But before we can read Rome or Greece, we have to try to read what was here first, before the empires, before the Greek name, when this place was still, only, Baalbek, the domain of the Lord. And that is where the writing gets faint, and the honest reader has to slow down. Here is what we know about Baalbek before the Romans, honestly, quietly, without inventing. We know that people were living in this valley by at least the early Bronze Age, roughly 5,000 years ago. We have pottery sherds, we have burials, we have the kinds of scraped, modest, domestic traces that archaeologists find in every inhabited valley across the Levant. We know that, by the Middle Bronze Age, someone was making offerings at a sanctuary on this exact spot, because the Romans would never have built their Temple of Jupiter on a patch of ground that had no existing sacredness. Empires do not invent holy places, they recognize them. And we know the name of the god, or at least one of his names, Baal, or Hadad in the older Semitic languages, or, in some sources, Baal-Hadad, a compound, the way a Roman might say Jupiter Optimus Maximus. He was a storm god, a rain god, a god of the thundercloud that crosses the Lebanon mountains at the end of the dry season and breaks over the Bekaa, and fills the wadis and makes the wheat grow. In a valley whose entire agricultural year depends on mountain storms, arriving at the right time, a God who controls those storms is not a luxury. He is the difference between a good year and a starving year, between the town and the ruin. So, a Bronze Age sanctuary dedicated to a storm god on a piece of ground that already had a spring. That is, roughly, what we can say. Here's the thing. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who walks you through a confident, detailed, cinematic picture of what pre-Roman Baalbek looked like, who tells you there was a great terrace, or a colossal high place, or a Phoenician megalithic platform, is filling in the gaps with imagination. We do not have the evidence for that picture. We have the outline, we have the name of the god, we have a few inscriptions, we have some fragmentary Iron Age pottery, and we have the obvious, honest inference that a sacred place this important in the Roman period must have been important before the Roman period, because sacredness, in the ancient world, was sticky, and the Romans were builders, not founders of cults. But we do not have the pre-Roman temple in our hands. We have, in our hands, the Roman temple, and under it, somewhere down in the foundations, stones that we think are older and cannot quite date. This is honest scholarship. It is also, if I'm being careful with you, the exact place where honest scholarship usually loses ground to speculation. The gap between we don't know and we can't say is very narrow, but the gap between we don't know and, therefore it must have been aliens, that gap is a canyon, and we are going to stay on the honest side of it tonight. There is one thing we can say, though, and it matters. Sacred places once established are remarkably hard to kill. Consider the pattern. Baal is worshipped here. Then Greek-speaking administrators arrive and translate Baal, loosely, into Helios and Zeus. Then Roman imperial patronage arrives and builds, on this exact spot, a temple to Jupiter. Then Christian emperors arrive 3 centuries later and build, on this exact spot, a basilica. Then Muslim rulers arrive 4 centuries after that and build, on this exact spot, a fortress. Then the modern Lebanese state arrives in the 20th century and inscribes on this exact spot a UNESCO monument. 6 cultures, 6 languages, 6 theologies, 1 location. That is not an accident. That is not 6 separate decisions. That is the same decision, made 6 times, by 6 different groups of people who arrived in this valley, looked at the spring and the crossroads and the sky, and independently of each other said, "This is the place," which suggests something a little strange and a little quiet. Sacred places may be less about the beliefs of any particular culture and more about the geography itself, about what, in a valley or on a mountain or beside a spring, the human mind keeps, across millennia, recognizing as special. When a Bronze Age Canaanite farmer looked up at the thunderclouds breaking over the anti-Lebanon and felt, in his chest, that something powerful was happening in the sky above this valley, and a Roman engineer 2,000 years later looked at the same clouds and made the same judgment, and built the largest temple in Syria here, they were not precisely worshipping the same god. But they may have been responding to the same landscape. That is what palimpsests teach you. The ink changes, the scribes change, the handwriting changes, but the sheet of parchment, the piece of ground itself, holds the memory of every earlier reading, and of all the things this particular piece of ground remembers the single oldest, the single most stubborn, the one that was here before any of the 6 cultures arrived and will be here after the 7th is the water, because there is a spring on this hill, and that spring is what made Baalbek possible. So before we meet Rome, before we meet Jupiter, before we walk up to the great Trilithon, let's walk together, for just a few minutes, to the quiet stone basin just north of the sanctuary. Let's stand at the mouth of the spring that made all of this inevitable, and let's talk about water. Because of everything we are about to see tonight, the giant stones, the abandoned quarry, the emperors, the arguments, the long centuries of sleeping ruins, none of it happens without what comes out of the ground, right here, every day, quietly, in the dark. Imagine standing here at 3 in the morning. The town is asleep. The ruins, about a quarter-mile south, are a darker shape against a dark sky. The moon is bright enough that you can see your own shadow on the flagstones, and there is a sound, small, continuous, unremarkable that has been the soundtrack of this valley for longer than any human memory can reach. Water, moving over stone. This is Ras al-Ain, the head of the spring in Arabic. It is not a grand sight. It is a stone basin, reinforced over centuries by different hands, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, modern Lebanese, each layer patching the last. Water rises into the basin from somewhere down in the limestone below, keeps a constant temperature year-round, and then flows away south and east, down the Bekaa, toward the eventual Litani River. It has been doing this, without a significant interruption, for at least 10,000 years. In a semi-arid highland valley where the rainfall varies year to year, where a bad drought can kill a village, where every other settlement for 40 kilometers in each direction depends on cisterns and runoff a year round, high volume, clean water spring is the single most valuable resource in antiquity. More valuable than gold, more valuable than salt. Because gold does not keep a child alive in August. Here's the thing about the scale. Modern estimates of the spring's historical flow put it, conservatively, in the range of tens of thousands of cubic meters of water per day. To put that in language, that means something enough water, every single day, to fill roughly 4 to 6 Olympic swimming pools. Or, in the vocabulary of modern cities, enough, alone, to supply the daily drinking needs of a town of roughly 20 to 30,000 people every day, without pumping, without plumbing, without a reservoir, for 100 centuries. If you are a Bronze Age farmer, or a Phoenician caravan master, or a Roman colonial engineer, an Umayyad administrator, or a Fatimid governor, and you are looking for a place to put a sanctuary, a market, a fortress, a basilica, a festival, a town, you do not put it where the water might be, you put it where the water is, permanently, reliably, without effort. That is the whole story of Baalbek, in a sentence. The spring made the sanctuary inevitable. Everything else, the Temple of Baal, the Temple of Jupiter, the Trilithon, the Corinthian columns, the abandoned 1,600-ton block up in the Quarry was an argument that humans built on top of water. You can tell a lot about a civilization by what it builds on top of its water. Some cultures build wells, some build aqueducts, some build taverns. The people who came to Baalbek, century after century, built temples, because in this valley, water and the divine were, from the beginning, the same question, and that question is older than any stone in the ruins we are about to walk into. So, now we know why here. Now we know why the ground itself was sacred before any god was named. It is time, finally, to meet the empire that built the temple we are about to stand inside. Rome is coming up the valley. Rome does not arrive in Baalbek the way Rome arrives in Gaul, or Britain, or Dacia. There is no conquest battle, no siege, no triumphal arch celebrating the fall of a resistant king. Rome arrives here the way water arrives in a cistern, slowly, over generations, finding the shape of the place it flows into. The Bekaa Valley passes into Roman control in the 1st century before our era, during the long reorganization of the eastern Mediterranean that follows Pompey's campaigns. Baalbek is absorbed into the province of Syria. For roughly the next 700 years, it is a Roman town, or rather, a Greek-speaking, locally Semitic, Roman-administered town. Everyone in the valley is bilingual at least. Most are trilingual. They speak their Aramaic at home, their Greek in the marketplace, and their Latin when an official from the provincial capital comes through with a tax roll, and starting sometime in the reign of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, around the turn of the millennium, imperial money begins to arrive. The scale of what gets built here over the next 2.5 centuries is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. Let me try. By the middle of the 3rd century, Heliopolis, which is what the Romans are calling Baalbek, now contains a colossal temple of Jupiter, one of the largest temples in the Roman world. A beautifully preserved temple of Bacchus, smaller, but arguably even richer in carved detail than the Jupiter temple, a round temple of Venus, a great court the size of a football field, a propylaea, a monumental entrance staircase, a hexagonal forecourt, altars, lion-headed rainspouts, columns, 22 meters tall, each cut from a single piece of granite shipped from Aswan, in Egypt more than 2,000 kilometers away. This is not a provincial temple. This is an imperial statement. Rome is saying something here, in this Lebanese valley, about its own seriousness. Here's the thing. It was not Augustus alone who built this. No emperor is ever the only person behind a project this large. Here is the patronage chain, roughly, across the centuries, because the chain is the story. At the top, 7 emperors, at minimum, directly fund construction at Baalbek. Augustus begins the Jupiter Temple. Nero continues it. Antoninus Pius, a mild, careful, nearly forgotten emperor of the 2nd century, brings it to something close to completion. Then the Severans Septimius Severus, Caracalla, and their successors add the Great Court, the Propylaea, the final rounds of decoration. Philip the Arab, in the 240s, is the last major imperial patron. He is, as it happens, himself a Syrian, and this may be the last grand imperial building project at Heliopolis before the crisis of the 3rd century collapses the finances. Beneath the emperors are the provincial governors, the men who actually live in Syria, who decide which contractor gets which quarry, who sign off on the budget overruns. Beneath them, the city council of Heliopolis, local notables, landowners, men whose own names appear on dedicatory inscriptions we can still read today. Beneath them, the architects mostly anonymous, but a few we can almost recover. We know the name of an architect of Corinthian capitals at Baalbek from a Greek inscription on one of the column drums, a man named Diodoros. Beneath the architects, the surveyors who laid out the foundations. Beneath the surveyors, the stonemasons, Phoenician, Greek, Egyptian, a truly international labour force. Beneath them, the Roman legionaries seconded from the Syrian garrisons, whose engineering manuals still survive in copies. And beneath them all, the thousands upon thousands of seasonal labourers drawn from the local Bekaa villages, Aramaic-speaking farmers who, in the months after harvest and before planting, came up the hill and pulled ropes. Not aliens, not one genius, not a single mind, a network, a patronage chain, 250 years long, running from emperor down to labourer, with every link paid in something: money, honour, meat, bread, a place in an inscription, a name on a stone. This is how empires build, not through magic, through hierarchy, through payroll. Let me take you, for a moment, to one specific evening in this chain. This is the kind of evening that is easy to lose, because no one thought to write it down in detail. But we can reconstruct it, honestly, from what we do have. It is sometime around the year 217 of the Common Era. The great court of the Temple of Jupiter, which Septimius Severus has been expanding for the last 15 years of his life, is finally ready for a formal dedication. Severus himself is dead by now, killed in campaign in Britain in 211. But his son Caracalla has carried on the building, and now Caracalla is dead too, assassinated a few months ago outside Edessa. The dedication, long planned, long funded, goes ahead anyway. Imagine it. It is dusk. The sun has just dropped behind the western rim of Mount Lebanon. The stone of the great court, still warm from the afternoon, gives off that particular limestone smell, warm calcium, dust, a hint of iron that anyone who has walked in ancient stone ruins at sunset anywhere in the Mediterranean knows. Oil lamps, bronze, olive oil burning, have been placed along the edge of the colonnade. Their smoke rises in thin, steady threads into the air above the court. 1,000 Syrian legionaries, in full parade armour, are standing in silence across the flagstones. Local notables, in Greek-style tunics and Roman togas, wait behind them. The crowd is perhaps 10,000 people, and at the top of the steps of the great altar, a priest is reading, in Latin, the dedicatory inscription of the emperor who paid for all of this, even though the emperor is no longer alive to hear it. Septimius Severus. Lucius Septimius Severus, Pertinax Augustus, born in what is now Libya, died in what is now northern England, lived, fought, ruled, across an empire whose eastern edge looked like this valley, these stones, this dusk. His purple-edged toga is long dissolved in some Roman mausoleum, but the name he put on this court is legible, in the crisp Latin capitals of a first-rate imperial stonecutter, on a fragment still standing on these flagstones. In the front row of the audience there is a man. His name is not recorded, but we can say what he is wearing. He is one of the Baalbek city councillors, a local landowner, perhaps the grandson of a man who himself contributed funds to the Temple of Bacchus 2 generations earlier. He is in his 50s. He is tired. He has seen 3 emperors die in the space of 6 years. He has attended 20 ceremonies like this one. The oil lamp smoke smells the same every time, and he is thinking about, not the god, not the emperor, but whether the grain shipment from Emesa will arrive before the first winter rains. This is what empire actually looks like from the inside, not conquest, not aliens. A tired local councillor, in good sandals, standing in the warm smoke of 1,000 bronze oil lamps, watching a priest read a dead man's name and worrying about grain. The priest finishes. The crowd murmurs. The legion is dismissed. The lamps are left to burn down on their own. Slowly, across the next hour, the great court empties, and the stones cool now in the night air settle back into the slow life they have led for the last century and will lead for the next 18 centuries. This is the court Septimius Severus built, and in a few minutes we are going to walk directly into it and meet the stones, because under the great court directly, physically, holding it up are 3 specific blocks of stone. They have been here since the generation before Severus. They are what, in the modern world, almost everyone has come to Baalbek to see. They are the reason you clicked on this video. Let's go meet them. There is a staircase on the western side of the Temple of Jupiter that descends to the base of the podium. It is not a grand staircase. It is a modern archaeological path, cut in the 20th century to let visitors see what a Roman visitor would not have seen: the underside of the temple, the foundations, the parts nobody was meant to notice. And as you come down that staircase and turn to face the western wall of the podium, you realise, all at once, why 18 generations of travellers have made the journey out to this valley. 3 blocks of limestone are embedded in the wall, about 8 metres above the ground, side by side. Each one about 19 metres long, roughly a 6-storey building laid on its side, each one about 3 metres high. Each one, depending on which modern engineer you ask, somewhere between 750 and 1,100 tons in weight, and they are set in the wall with the joints between them so tight that a 21st century archaeologist with a credit card cannot slip the card into the seam. The fit is measured in centimetres, perhaps in millimetres. The tops are level, the faces are dressed. We call this, collectively, the Trilithon. Greek, 3 stones, a flat, practical name for 3 blocks that are anything but flat and practical. Here's the thing. Everyone asks the same question. How much do they weigh? And if you read around the subject, you will find estimates anywhere from 600 tons to 1,200 tons per block. This looks, at first, like confusion, as if modern engineers cannot agree, as if the very weight of the stones is a mystery. It is not a mystery, it is an assumption problem. The weight of a block is its volume times the density of the stone. The volume, for the Trilithon, we know well we can measure these blocks directly from outside the wall. The numbers come out in the range of 230 to 260 cubic meters each. That part is solid. But the density. The density depends on what kind of limestone this is, and limestone is not a single substance. Dense, fine-grained limestones, the kind used in good Roman dress stone work, run about 2.6 to 2.7 tons per cubic meter. Lighter, more porous limestones, which is what the Baalbek quarry actually gives us, run closer to 2.5. Swap one density for the other, and your estimate shifts by 10%. Multiply by 250 cubic meters, and the uncertainty of the weight of the Trilithon comes out to about 80 tons per block, which is exactly the range of variation you see in the published estimates. Modern weight ranges differ because assumptions differ, not because the stones are magical. When someone tells you, dramatically, that science cannot even agree how much the Trilithon weighs, they are not exposing an ancient mystery. They are exposing the fact that weight equals volume times density, and they have not multiplied it out. This is going to be a recurring pattern tonight. Every time a claim of impossible is made about Baalbek, the impossibility dissolves quietly into a calculation that simply wasn't done. But let us not minimize what is actually here, because, calculation aside, what is actually here is still genuinely astonishing. Let me walk you through the comparison. Imagine, for a moment, a kind of megalithic tour of the ancient world. 5 stops, 1 night, Stop one. Giza, Egypt. The Great Pyramid. 2300 BCE. The most famous megalithic monument in the world. Roughly 2.3 million limestone and granite blocks. Average block weight about 2.5 tons. The very largest blocks. In the King's Chamber, 60 to 80 tons. Astonishing engineering. Millions of blocks. Most of them, by modern standards, movable by a small team with a wooden sledge. Stop 2. Wiltshire, England. Stonehenge. Roughly 2500 BCE. 30 sarsen stones, the big ones you see from a distance. Average sarsen weight about 25 tons. The largest, perhaps 30. Moved, we now think, around 25 kilometres from the Marlborough Downs. A 50-year project for a Neolithic community. Remarkable. Small by later standards. Stop 3. Ollantaytambo, in the Peruvian Andes, 15th century of the Common Era. Inca stonework. The famous wall of the Temple of the Sunday. Individual blocks around 50 to 70 tons, some approaching 90. Fitted like the Trilithon without mortar. Transported up a steep mountain valley from a quarry on the other side. Extraordinary. Stop 4. Yangshan, just outside Nanjing, in China, early 15th century. A single unfinished steely block, cut for the Ming Emperor Yongle, lying in the quarry where it was abandoned. The largest individual worked stone any culture has ever attempted to move. Modern estimate around 16,000 tons. Never moved. Never erected. The project was abandoned because the engineers realized, correctly, that the logistics were beyond them. An honest monument to the limits of imperial ambition. And stop 5. Baalbek. The Trilithon, 1st century of the Common Era. 3 blocks, each as we have just established between 750 and 1,000 tons. And, unlike Yangshan, not left in the quarry, lifted to a height of 8 meters and fitted, side by side, with centimeter precision, into the wall of a temple foundation. That is the comparison. Giza at 2.5 tons per average block, Stonehenge at 25, Ollantaytambo at 70, Yangshan at 16,000, unfinished. Baalbek at 800, finished. The Trilithon sits in an unusual place on that spectrum. It is the largest set of stones that any ancient culture is known to have successfully placed in a wall. The Egyptians moved larger individual blocks, occasionally, but did not lift 800-ton blocks into elevated positions. The Incas worked at scales most ancient cultures cannot match, but their blocks are still an order of magnitude smaller. The Ming Emperor's men tried something 5 times larger and gave up. Only the Romans, at Baalbek, in one specific century, actually completed a lift of this magnitude, and they did it 3 times, side by side, with no visible seam. This is not impossible, but it is also not ordinary. It is what engineers mean when they say a project is at the edge of the possible. And here's the thing. Whoever placed these blocks did not simply get them roughly into position and shrug. Look closely. You can, on a clear afternoon, put your hand against the joint between the first and second stones of the Trilithon and feel with your fingertips that the cut faces of the 2 blocks have been dressed flat to within the thickness of a sheet of paper, across 19 meters of length, at a mass of 800 tons, 8 meters above the ground. The fit is not approximate. The fit is refined. It is as if the builders, having already performed the miracle of moving 800 tons into the air, refused to let themselves be sloppy about the final seating. Their pride is visible. It is in the micrometers. Notice what this tells you about them. These were not people who believed scale was an excuse. They were people who believed that if you were going to move a stone the size of a building, you might as well set it down with the care of a jeweler setting a stone in a ring. That attitude, that refusal to let difficulty become permission for imprecision, is, in its way, more impressive than the lifting itself. Magic does not require precision. Magic, in principle, is rough. Real engineering, by people who take their craft seriously, that is what leaves you, 2,000 years later, unable to fit a credit card into a seam. And none of this tells you how they got there. How 3 blocks weighing together roughly 2,500 tons ended up 8 meters above ground, side by side, seamless. That we will get to. That is a story about ramps and ropes and water on sand and thousands of pairs of hands and a kind of seasonal labour calendar that ancient states were very good at running, and we will spend a whole section on it. But before we can walk the physics, before we can stand with our hands on a rope on a 4th-hour haul in the Lebanese sun, there is one more thing we have to see. Because 800 metres from this podium, cut into the hillside, is a stone that was supposed to be part of this wall, a 4th block, larger than any of these 3, still half attached to the bedrock, still waiting. That stone has a name. The people of Baalbek, sometime in the medieval centuries, looked at its enormous, gently curving flank and called it Hajar el-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman. It was cut, very nearly freed, and then abandoned. Nobody knows, for certain, why. That stone, and the 2 others near it, may be the most important evidence we have on the entire mystery of Baalbek. Not because they are bigger than the Trilithon, though they are, but because they are unfinished. They are the project plans, frozen in limestone, of a civilization that had reached exactly the edge of what it could do, and for reasons we will try, gently, to reconstruct, stepped back from the edge. Let us walk up the hill, in the long afternoon light, and go see them. It is about an 800-metre walk. 8 minutes, slowly, in warm sun. Come on, bring your water. There is no rush tonight. We are going to walk now. Not far. About 800 metres uphill on a dirt track walked by quarrymen and mules, and, more recently, tourists, for roughly 2,000 years. Leave the podium behind you. The great stones of the Trilithon are at your back. Ahead, on a gentle rise to the southwest, is a limestone outcrop the colour of old bone. That outcrop is the Quarry. That is where the stones came from, and that is where, on a still afternoon in some year we cannot quite pin down, 3 of the largest blocks ever cut by human beings were simply left. The track climbs slowly. The ground underfoot is a fine white dust mixed with flakes of limestone, the kind of dust that settles into the creases of your boots and will not come out for a week. To your right, a row of low acacia trees throws a thin, moving shade. Somewhere in the distance, and this is the sound that will stay with you from Baalbek. If you come here in person, you can hear goat bells. Small, steady, a little flat in the high-altitude air, the sound of an animal economy that has not fundamentally changed since the Bronze Age. When you arrive at the quarry, the first thing you notice is that it is not really one quarry. It is a face of exposed bedrock, maybe 100 metres across, with trenches cut into it at different depths and different ages. Some of the cuts are shallow, the usual ordinary cutting marks of people taking ordinary-sized stones for ordinary-sized buildings. But near the centre there is something else. There is a block, still half attached to the hillside, that is not ordinary. It is called, in the local Arabic, Hajar el-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman. No one is entirely sure when it got that name, or why. The most charming folk explanation is that a pregnant woman, long ago, claimed she could lift it. The less charming explanation is that the shape, seen from a certain angle in a certain light, suggested something maternal. Either way, the name stuck. The stone is roughly 21 metres long, 4.5 metres wide, 4 metres high. 3 trenches have been cut around it, 2 long sides and 1 end. The 4th side is still connected to the bedrock underneath by a ridge of unworked stone that the quarryman, for some reason, never finished cutting through. Weight estimates vary, and this is the honest place, where we have to slow down, because the weight you see quoted on the internet for this stone is usually 1,200 tons, sometimes 1,000, sometimes 1,500. The real answer? It depends. On the density of the limestone, on the exact dimensions, and on whether you measure from the visible faces or the estimated volume. The most cited technical figures are in the range of 1,000 to 1,200 tons, somewhere in there. And right beside it, about 100 metres away, discovered in a more thorough survey in 2014, is another block, larger. Genuinely larger. This one is the stone in our title, the 1,600-ton block, 20 metres long, roughly 6 metres wide, 5.5 metres high. Density estimates put it conservatively at about 1,650 tons. Some engineers have pushed that figure a little higher. Whichever number you trust, it is as far as anyone has ever measured the single largest block of cut stone on the planet. More than twice the weight of the largest stone in the Great Pyramid, Heavier than a fully fueled, fully loaded Boeing 747 cargo plane. Heavier than 10 Boeing 747s. And it, too, is still half attached to the hill. Here's the thing about these blocks. They are not, as is sometimes claimed, impossible. They are not miracles. They are not proof of a lost civilization. They are if you walk up and put your hand on one of them, as you are doing now. In the cooling afternoon, something much stranger and much more human. They are frozen project plans. Look at the tool marks. Look carefully. The surface of the exposed face is not smooth. It is covered in a regular pattern of shallow, rectangular gouges, the mark of an iron or bronze pick, swung by a human arm at roughly the same angle, over and over, for weeks or months. In certain corners you can still see the sockets where wooden wedges were hammered into the rock and then soaked with water, so that as the wood expanded it would split the stone along a planned line. You can see the extraction trenches, narrow corridors a metre wide where a succession of workers stood shoulder to shoulder and chipped downward for the time it takes a child to grow from infancy to school age. This is not magic. This is the patient, appalling, coordinated work of hundreds of human beings doing the same small thing every day for years because someone was paying them or feeding them or in some cases owned them. And at some point, all of those people stopped. Here's where Baalbek stops feeling supernatural and starts feeling human. Because the question the block on the hillside actually asks is not how did they move it. The question it asks is, why did they not finish? And that question has, disappointingly, several ordinary answers. 1. The stone may have had a hidden flaw. Limestone of this kind, sedimentary bedded ancient marine deposit, has invisible weaknesses. A single long crack, discovered late in the cutting, turns a monolith into firewood. The quarrymen walk away and start on the next one, because a cracked 3,000-ton block in a Roman-era quarry is not a setback you recover from. 2. The design may have changed. Imperial projects do that. An architect in Rome revises the plan. A new emperor prefers a different layout. The 30-year project that began in Augustus's reign has by now outlived 3 emperors. The block that was going to be the 4th member of the Trilithon is suddenly not needed. Word reaches Baalbek 6 weeks late, on a donkey, carried by a bureaucrat. Work stops. The stone stays. 3. An earthquake. The Bekaa Valley sits near the Dead Sea Transform Fault, and the region has had a major earthquake roughly every 1 to 300 years, reliably, for as long as we have records. A single tremor during the final stages of cutting is enough to end a project. If the hillside shifts, the block shifts, the plan changes. 4. Political collapse. The empire funding the project runs out of money, or changes its mind, or its emperor is assassinated, and the next one has different priorities. The stone, which would have required 1,000 labourers and a favourable season and a clear road to move, no longer has any of those things. The paying client is gone, the workers go home. Any one of these, or any combination of them, explains why a stone the weight of a small mountain is still lying in a Lebanese quarry 2,000 years later, almost free of the earth. You do not need aliens. You do not need lost civilizations. You need a bad day, a bad decade, or a bad emperor. And this is, I think, the quiet dignity of this place. The block on the hillside is not a monument to impossibility. It is a monument to an attempt, a real, physical, costly, coordinated human attempt that did not, for whatever reason, succeed. There is something about an unfinished thing that tells you more than a finished thing ever could. A cathedral that was completed is just a cathedral. A cathedral whose tower was never finished tells you about money and plague and the year the stonecutter's son died. The Trilithon down in the podium, perfectly placed, tells you the Romans could do this. The block up here in the quarry, half-cut and abandoned, tells you that even they sometimes could not. Put your hand on it if you like. The stone is warm from the afternoon sun. You can feel, very faintly, the corrugation of the old tool marks against your palm. Someone stood right here, maybe in the year 60 of our era, with a bronze or iron pick in his hand, swinging at this exact surface, and thinking, probably, about lunch, or about his back, or about the woman he planned to marry, if he lived. He didn't know his work would be preserved forever, because it was never finished. He didn't know that 2,000 years later, A stranger from a country that did not yet exist would stand here in the slowly cooling dust of a Lebanese hillside and put a hand on the exact mark his pick made. You are, whether you meant to or not, the only audience he ever got. Walk around the block. Go slowly. The stone takes a while to get around. The long side is a bowing fuselage. Notice, on the far side, a set of slots cut near the top. Those are the sockets where the wooden levers would have gone. They are still there, waiting. The quarrymen, when they left for the last time, set the tools back down and walked downhill to the town. They thought they were coming back tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. And here's what nobody tells you about this quarry. The reason this hillside is the most famous unfinished construction site in the ancient world is not because it is impossible. It is famous because it is almost finished. A few more months of work, a favourable season, a living emperor, and the block on the hillside would have been moved. It would have joined the three in the podium, and it would have been a fourth member of the Trilithon, and no one would ever speculate about aliens, because the fourth stone would be sitting exactly where it was planned to sit, and we would call it ordinary. Ordinariness is the thing the block almost achieved. It missed by a season, or a fault line, or a budget meeting, and in missing, it became famous. All of which raises a question we have so far, politely, avoided. Because if these blocks, the ones in the podium, the ones still in the quarry, were going to be moved, then how, exactly, were they going to be moved? That is not a rhetorical question. That has a real answer. And the answer, like everything else at Baalbek, is more human than you think. Here's the thing about moving 1,000-ton stone. The enemy is not the weight. That sentence is, I promise, the whole secret of Baalbek. If you understand that sentence, you understand how a pre-industrial civilization, working with rope and wood and animal fat, could shift a block heavier than a modern warship down a hillside. If you do not understand it, you end up with aliens. So let's understand it slowly. Imagine for a second that you are pushing a full shopping trolley across a car park. The trolley weighs, say, 20 kilograms loaded. You can push it with 2 fingers. Now imagine the same trolley, same weight, on a gravel footpath. Suddenly you need both hands and a little bit of a grunt. Same weight, same object, different surface, different friction. Friction is the quiet villain of every large object you have ever tried to move. Friction scales, roughly, with weight but only roughly. A block sitting on a smooth wooden track, with animal fat smeared underneath, has a coefficient of friction somewhere around 0.1. The same block sitting on dry sand has a coefficient around 0.66 times worse. The same block on wet sand has a coefficient around 0.2, much better. Water on sand, for reasons a physicist can explain, and a Bronze Age farmer could feel in his back, halves the effort of moving the stone. The Egyptians knew this. There is a surviving wall painting from the tomb of the governor Jehuti-Hotep, roughly 1900 BCE, showing the transport of a colossal statue, 60 tons, roughly, on a wooden sled. A single figure stands at the front of the sled, pouring water onto the sand ahead of the runners. Scholars argued about this figure for almost a century. Many thought he was performing a religious rite. Some thought he was anointing the statue. In 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam tested the actual mechanics. He was not performing a ritual, he was reducing friction by about half. If the Egyptians, in roughly 1900 BCE, had figured this out, and they did then, by the time the Romans arrived in the Bekaa 2,000 years later, with the accumulated engineering of 20 centuries behind them, this was, as we would now say, settled technology. Let's take our time with this, there's no rush. So, friction first. The Roman toolbox for moving 1,000-ton stone included, roughly, the following. A wooden sled, a massive oak cradle, fitted to the block, with runners as thick as a man's torso. Tracks laid ahead of the sled, changed constantly as the block moved forward, made of timbers embedded in a prepared roadbed. Lubricant animal fat, vegetable oil, clay slurry, and, critically, water poured in front of the runners on a sand bed. Wooden rollers, where the terrain allowed. Levers iron-tipped, oak-shafted, taller than a man. Capstans vertical wooden drums that 10 or 20 men could walk around. Winding a hemp rope and generating a pulling force far greater than any of them could produce, unaided. The engineer, Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BCE, discusses several of these machines as standard equipment for Roman military and civil construction. He does not describe them with the pride of a man revealing a secret. He describes them with the slight boredom of a man listing the tools in a toolbox. Here's the thing about a capstan. A capstan is a simple vertical drum with a set of horizontal poles sticking out of it. Men walk around the drum, pushing the poles. The drum rotates. A rope wound around the drum tightens. The force the men produce is multiplied by the ratio of the drum's circumference to the distance from the drum's axis, where they are walking typically somewhere between 20 and 50 to 1. In plain language, one person walking around a capstan, pushing a pole, can match the pull of about 40 people pulling direct on the rope. If you use 40 people on the capstan, you match the pull of about 1,600 people pulling direct. And this is before you add a pulley system, which can double or triple the advantage again. This is not lost technology. This is the same technology used to haul every Mediterranean cargo ship into harbour for the next 1800 years. It is still in use, in slightly refined form, on modern tall ships. A hand-operated capstan today, built on an Iron Age design, can generate pulling forces in the low tens of tons without power tools. Now place, in your mind, 20 or 30 of these capstans around a prepared corridor that runs from the quarry down to the podium. A distance, and this is the decisive geological fact, of only about 800 metres. 800 metres. That is the gift of Baalbek's geology. The Romans did not have to move these stones across a desert, or up a river, or over a mountain pass. They had to move them downhill, on prepared track, for less than a kilometre from a quarry that had been purpose-chosen, in part, for its short haul to the building site, and they had a labour supply. Not infinite, but deep. The Roman imperial system had 3 overlapping labour pools. Legionaries, professional soldiers of the standing army, trained as engineers as much as fighters, available for large civil projects during peacetime. State corvée labour, a kind of seasonal conscription of local peasants, called up after harvest when their hands were free and the weather was cool. And professional guilds of quarrymen and stonemasons moving from project to project around the empire. Put them together, and in a good season a project like Baalbek might have 1,500 to 3,000 trained hands on site at once. Soldiers on capstan duty, peasants on rope, masons on the block itself. The work happened in windows, after the grain harvest, when the ground was firm and cool, before the winter rains, when the track would turn to mud. A single stone might be moved over several such windows, inch by inch, across 2 or 3 seasons. Which brings us, finally, to the most important thing we can do at Baalbek, which is, for just a few minutes, to stop being the person on the viewing platform and become, instead, one of those hands on the rope. Imagine it, now, slowly. Your hands are on a hemp rope as thick as your wrist. The rope is slick with sweat and rough with dust. 50 other pairs of hands are on the rope ahead of you, 50 behind. You cannot see the front of the rope. It disappears over a slight rise in the track and down into a cloud of pale dust. It is the 4th hour of the haul. The sun has not yet quite moved. You know this because you have been checking, half consciously, against the shadow of the cedar tree at the edge of the field, and the shadow has only shifted the width of your hand. Dust coats your tongue. You have learned by now not to wipe your mouth because your sleeve is worse than your teeth. You have also learned to breathe through your nose, slowly, because the men who breathe through their mouths don't last a full shift. Every few minutes a voice ahead of you calls a 2-syllable cadence, hup-yah, hup-yah. 200 bodies pull against it in one breath. The rope tightens. You feel, through your shoulders, the slight jerk as the block shifts forward, somewhere ahead of you, on the runners, then slack, then the cadence again, then pull. You've been doing this since about the 4th hour after dawn. You will keep doing it until the overseer calls the rest, which will be when the sun reaches the top of the quarry face, which will be, you estimate, in another hour. At the rest, there will be water, cold from the spring at al-Ain, carried up in leather bags. There will be bread. There will be, if it is a good day, olives. There may or may not be onions. You do not know the name of the emperor who commissioned this project. You have heard the name a few times at the dedications, but it doesn't interest you. You know the name of the man pulling beside you, because he is your brother-in-law, and he has been working this shift for the last 9 days, and he has a cough that his wife is worried about. You know the name of the overseer because you have to. You know that tonight, when the shift ends, there will be bread baking in a clay oven in the village, and the smell of it will reach you from half a kilometre away, and your wife will hand you a cup of something warm that she has pretended was easy to prepare, and you will sit on a low wooden bench with your back against a stone wall that is still warm from the sun, and you will sleep on a woven mat, and in the morning you will do this again. You know the stone will move, because it has moved at least a hand's breadth every day this month. It will continue to move because you and the rest will keep pulling until it does. You know this is not magic. You know this because your hands are on it. This is how 1,000 tons of stone moves, across 800 meters, across several seasons, in the 1st century of our era. Not by aliens, not by lost civilizations, by brothers-in-law and bread, and a woman at home with a cough to worry about. But horizontal motion across prepared track is only half the problem. At some point the stone has to stop being dragged and start being lifted. It has to rise 7 or 8 meters to its final position in the great podium, which is a different problem, and a more interesting one. Let's walk back down to the temple and look at how they did it. Imagine the block, now, at the foot of the podium. It has come down the 800 meters from the quarry. It is sitting on its oak cradle, on a prepared track, a metre or so above the valley floor. Above it, 7 meters up, maybe 8 is the spot in the rising wall of the temple platform where it is meant to go. How do you get it up there? Not by levitating it, not by sound frequencies, not by pouring a secret concrete, by building around and underneath the block a structure that did not exist yesterday and will not exist tomorrow, and which, for a few weeks, does the work of the eventual wall. The method has a name. It is called cribbing. Cribbing is one of the oldest and simplest engineering techniques in the human toolbox, and it is still used today, in slightly refined form, to lift houses off their foundations, to raise collapsed bridges, and to move locomotives in rail yards. It is the thing any modern engineer reaches for. First, when the task is, move a very heavy thing a short vertical distance, carefully. It works like this. You take 2 timbers, short and thick, and lay them parallel on the ground, about the length of the block apart. On top of them, at right angles, you lay 2 more, then 2 more, at right angles again on top of those. You have just built, in miniature, a crib, a square tower of interlocking timbers with a flat top. A small crib is about the size of a kitchen table. A large crib, for a Baalbek block, is the size of a small house. Now you raise the block, a small amount, say 20 or 30 centimeters, using levers and capstans. Underneath the raised block, you slide 1 more layer of cribbing. Then you lower. The block now rests on the new top layer. The old cradle is higher off the ground than before, and the crib is taller. You have gained 30 centimeters. You do this, patiently, 1,000 times. Each iteration is a small, ordinary engineering task, performed by the same crew, over and over, with a foreman counting off the passes. In 2 or 3 months, the block has climbed, centimetre by centimetre, to its final height. At the same time, and this is the elegant part, the cribbing tower is growing inside what will eventually be the temple's fill. The podium is not, structurally, a stack of giant limestone blocks. It is a retaining wall made of giant blocks, with a rubble and mortar core filling the space behind. As each cribbing layer goes up, rubble is poured around it, timbers are gradually trapped, and the structure of the future podium grows organically around the machine that built it. When the block finally reaches its designated row, it is slid sideways, off the top of the crib, onto a prepared bedding surface. The cribbing is disassembled, or in some cases simply buried, and the next block begins its slow climb. And when they say slid sideways onto a prepared bedding surface, they mean precisely this. The bedding course of stone below the Trilithon is dressed, cut, and levelled to a tolerance of a few millimetres. The bottom face of the Trilithon block, before it is lifted, is also dressed to the same tolerance. Oil is spread on the bedding. The block is slid into position on the oil film, which acts as a hydraulic cushion during the final inches of movement. Iron-tipped pry bars, applied at the corners, are used to nudge the block millimetre by millimetre until it lands in its final spot. Here's the thing about that tolerance. The final joints between the 3 Trilithon blocks, each weighing roughly 800 tons, are tight enough that, in most places, you cannot slide a playing card between them. I want you to hold that in your mind for a second. 800 tons. Landing, by rope and capstan and oil and pry bar, on a surface prepared to a precision of less than a millimetre. Not by a laser-guided crane. By a team of masons using a plumb line and a straight edge and, in all probability, a lot of swearing. The physics is not the miracle. The coordination is the miracle. Because this project, raising the Trilithon, placing the bedding, orchestrating the cribbing, moving the blocks in sequence, with seasonal breaks for weather, and with a roster of workers who are dying and retiring and being replaced, this project takes, on current archaeological estimates, somewhere between 30 and 60 years. From the day the first pick strikes rock in the quarry to the day the last block slides into position, 2 generations. A boy who was a water carrier at the start is, by the end, the foreman. His grandson is the water carrier again. The building is a machine not only for worship, but for passing the technique down. Every older mason, every retiring legionary engineer, carries a piece of the method in his hands and his head. He teaches it to an apprentice. The apprentice teaches the next. The capstan is not just a tool, it is a curriculum. The site is not just a building site, it is a school. When Baalbek's great court is finally finished, sometime in the middle of the 3rd century of our era, the men who laid the first stone have been dead for 70 years. The men who laid the last one learned their trade from the sons of those men. This is the thing the ancient alien theorists miss, almost on purpose. They ask, could one generation do this? And they answer, correctly, no. What they miss is that it was never one generation. It was 5. It was a sustained, patient, unglamorous, multi-generational industrial program. The same kind of program that, much later, built the cathedrals at Chartres and Cologne. The same kind of program that, in our own time, has built the Large Hadron Collider and the International Space Station, which, if you think about it, is the most modern thing in the world. We too have projects that outlive their engineers. We too pass the technique down by apprenticeship. We too lift impossible weights, slowly, across generations. Baalbek is not weird. Baalbek is the early template. But we're going to come back to this. Let's take our time with the idea. Because what we have just walked through, the friction, the capstans, the cribbing, the millimetre bedding, the 60-year roster is, in a real sense, the mechanical answer to the entire question the video title asks. The rest of our night is, mostly, other people's stories, about what happened to this place after it was built, about who visited it, and forgot it, and remembered it again, and tried to explain it, and got it partly wrong, and got it eventually right. But before we go anywhere else, let's stand here for a moment, on the west face of the podium, in the warm honey gold of the last half hour of sun. Let's look up at the 3 blocks. Knowing now, at least roughly, how they got there, they are still extraordinary, but they are not impossible. They are the finished form of a question. An unfinished block up on the hill is still asking, so, that is the how. Before we move on, take a slow breath. Let the weight of it settle for a moment. Now let's take a slower turn and look, for a while, at what the Romans carved onto all of this. Because the surface of Baalbek is as careful as its structure, and the surface tells us things the structure alone cannot. Walk with me, slowly, along the lower colonnade of the Temple of Jupiter. The columns above you, 22 metres high, each shaft made of 3 drums of pink Aswan granite, shipped across the eastern Mediterranean from Egypt, are the largest columns of their kind that survive anywhere in the ancient world. 6 of them still stand. Originally, there were 54. The rest fell in earthquakes, or were quarried for later buildings, or were burned to lime by medieval kilns. The tops of the columns, the capitals, are carved in the Corinthian style. You know this style, even if you don't know you know it. It is the one with the acanthus leaves, spiky, curling, organic leaves crawling up a stone drum and unfurling outward at the top into volutes like unrolled scrolls. It is, historically, a Greek invention, and by the 2nd century of our era, it has become the default decorative vocabulary of Roman imperial architecture from Scotland to Syria. But look closely at these particular capitals if the afternoon light is kind. Something is slightly off. The acanthus leaves at Baalbek are, and this is a thing Roman art historians argue about, Politely, in journals no one else reads a little more vegetal than strictly classical Corinthian. They curl a little more. They crowd the capital a little more densely. There is, in the best preserved fragments, a sense of botanical abundance that is not quite what you find in, say, the Pantheon in Rome or the Maison Carrée in Nîmes. The Baalbek capitals are a Corinthian that has, in some subtle way, eaten a lot of Phoenician and Syrian sunlight. This is what art historians call the Eastern inflection of Roman imperial style. It is a style that emerges, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in the sanctuaries of Syria, Lebanon, and the Eastern Mediterranean. It is identifiably Roman. It is also identifiably not Roman. It is a compromise between the formal classical vocabulary of imperial patronage and the older, denser, more ornamental traditions of the Phoenician and Aramaic-speaking craftsmen who actually cut the stone, which is what we should expect. The emperor in Rome pays the bill and approves the plan, but the hands on the chisels are local, and the local hands have grown up in a tradition that likes a slightly wilder vine. So the vine, in the final stonework, is slightly wilder. The empire does not quite notice, or quite mind. The sanctuary, in some quiet way, belongs to the people cutting it, as much as to the people funding it. Elsewhere, scattered across the complex, the carved decoration tells a specific theological story. The Jupiter of Heliopolis is not, precisely, the Jupiter of Rome. He is a fusion god. He is Jupiter sky, storm, thunder welded onto the older Baal-Hadad of the Semitic Valley, and further welded onto Helios, the sun god of Greek theology, and further welded, in the 3rd century, onto the solar theology trends sweeping through the empire. On the surviving carved friezes you can see the triad that was venerated in this valley, Jupiter in the centre, with the thunderbolt, Venus, or locally, the goddess Atagatis on one side, associated with water and fertility, and Bacchus, the god of wine and vine and the grape harvest, on the other. The second temple at Baalbek, smaller than the temple of Jupiter but more intact, was dedicated to Bacchus. It is in fact the most complete Roman temple surviving anywhere in the ancient world, which is a sentence that would surprise most Roman tourists, who assume that title belongs to something in Italy. But no, the most complete Roman temple on the planet is in Lebanon. And then there are the lions, around the upper edges of the temple roof, or rather, where the upper edges used to be there were rainspouts in the form of lions' heads. When the winter rains came down from the Lebanon range, water streamed out through the open stone mouths of maybe 30 or 40 carved lions, falling in thin streams into the courtyard below. Most of them have been broken off over the centuries. A handful survive in museums or in storage. 1 or 2 are still in place. A lion's head, carved in Lebanese limestone in the 2nd century of our era, spitting water into a Bekaa rainstorm that has long since ended. It is a small, almost domestic detail. The kind of detail that reminds you that someone designed this whole machine with the valley's actual weather in mind. The inscriptions, when you find them, are more prosaic. Most of the surviving inscriptions at Baalbek are dedicatory. They record the names of donors. They record the names of Emperors Augustus and his successors, Antoninus Pius, whose name is associated with major building campaigns in the middle of the 2nd century, Septimius Severus, who we met at dusk in the Great Court, Philip the Arab, an emperor born in nearby Shahba who, in the middle of the 3rd century, visited this Syrian sanctuary as a kind of homecoming. Some inscriptions are in Latin, some are in Greek. A few fragments are bilingual, the same dedication, in both languages, for a cosmopolitan audience. None that we have found, so far, are in the older Semitic scripts of the pre-Roman Valley, which is why the pre-Roman history has to be reconstructed mostly from the continuity of the sacred site itself, and not from the writing on the walls. And here's what nobody tells you about inscriptions, generally. Most inscriptions across all the ancient world are not poetry or theology or mysticism. Most inscriptions are receipts. Someone paid for a column, someone funded a wall, someone endowed a festival. The inscription records the gift for posterity, so that everyone walking past now and for the next 2,000 years will know who paid. It is, in a way, the original crowdfunding. Your name, in stone, in exchange for a donation. Emperors gave enormous gifts and got enormous credit. Local notables gave smaller gifts and got smaller credit. The craftsmen and labourers who actually cut the stone got no credit at all, because they were paid in bread and wine and, at the end of the day, forgetfulness. This is the quiet asymmetry of all monumental buildings. The names on the wall are the names of the payers. The names not on the wall are the names of the makers. And when we walk through Baalbek, 2,000 years later, we can read the first set of names, if we have Latin. We can only imagine the second. There's no rush tonight. Let's take our time with this. We have looked at the stones. We have looked at the carving. We have not yet looked, properly, at what actually happened inside this place, what the priests did, what the pilgrims came for, what the ordinary lived experience of a working Roman sanctuary actually was. So let's go, quietly, inside the sacred machine and meet the God it was built to serve. So, imagine it now. It is early in the 3rd century. It is a summer morning in Heliopolis. The sanctuary is at the height of its life. The great altar in the middle of the great court is warm already from the sun, which rises over the anti-Lebanon to the east and strikes the eastern face of the altar within minutes of dawn. At the altar, priests are performing what the Romans called the daily sacrifice. A small offering, grain, wine, a token of incense. Sometimes a small animal is burned in the morning. The smoke rises vertically in the still valley air, then bends slightly east, pushed by a light breeze coming down off the mountains. Around the court, pilgrims are arriving. Some are from nearby villages, peasants paying a vow for a good harvest, or for a sick child who recovered. Some have come from further. There are travellers on the road from Palmyra, 3 or 4 days east. There are merchants from Tyre and Sidon on the Phoenician coast, a day's climb west. There are legionary veterans on leave from the Syrian frontier who heard about Heliopolitan Jupiter from men in their unit who had been stationed in Berytus. And there are the long-distance pilgrims. Inscriptions in the sanctuary, over the centuries, record donors from Gaul, from Britain, from North Africa, from the Danubian provinces even, on one surviving stone from the far side of the Parthian border. They have come, mostly, for 2 things, the god and the oracle, because Heliopolitan Jupiter, unusually among Roman provincial cults, was an oracular god. He spoke, or at least, he answered. We know this because the Roman writer Macrobius in the early 5th century of our era describes the oracle of Heliopolis in some detail, probably drawing on older sources. The statue of the god, a golden or gilded figure carried in processions on a special litter, would respond to questions by moving. Not moving, exactly, in the sense that it walked. Moving in the sense that the litter, carried by priests, would appear to pull them forward, or to refuse to move, or to tilt in a particular direction in response to the questions being asked. A question was put to the god. The god, through the litter, answered, yes, no, not now, go south. To a modern reader, this sounds obviously stage-managed, and it probably was by priests who had a strong financial interest in the god's answers aligning with the sanctuary's politics. But here is the thing about oracles. They do not have to be ontologically real. They have to be institutionally functional. What matters, for the survival of a sanctuary, is not whether the god actually moves the litter. What matters is whether enough people, for long enough, believe the answer was worth the journey. And at Heliopolis, for at least 3 centuries, they did. Emperors, famously, consulted the oracle. The Emperor Trajan is said to have asked the god, before invading Parthia, whether his campaign would succeed. The god answered, and this is a detail Macrobius preserves by sending back the officer who had delivered the question without a reply. After 3 days of silence, Trajan took this as a bad omen. He was, in the event, correct. The Parthian campaign was his last, and he died on the way home. There are other stories. The Emperor Septimius Severus, whose dedication scene we watched 2 hours ago at dusk in the Great Court, is also associated in later sources with the Heliopolitan oracle, though here the record is thinner. Later still, in the 4th century, the Emperor Julian, who tried, briefly and unsuccessfully, to restore classical paganism, may have consulted the oracle. We don't fully know. What we do know is that the oracle mattered enough, in the imperial imagination, that its answers were remembered and written down and passed along. And around the oracle, there was a pilgrim economy, because nobody travels 3 weeks from Gaul to Lebanon without spending money. Inns, along the road from Berytus up to Baalbek, charged for beds and food. Guides at the sanctuary gates charged for tours. Vendors in the courtyard sold bronze votive figurines, small images of the god, or of the thunderbolt, or of the zodiac sign, the pilgrim associated with his birth. The priest charged a fee for the formal consultation. Small animals for sacrifice were bought at the altar and sold by agents who specialized in providing ritual-approved lambs. A festival probably held annually, possibly tied to the summer solstice, filled the town for days, with travelers, with performers, with merchants. The sanctuary was, in effect, the largest economic engine in the Bekaa Valley for most of the Roman period. This is not a spiritual disappointment. This is how all major sanctuaries in the ancient world worked. Delphi, Olympia, Epidaurus, all of them combined. Genuine religious function with a very large and very efficient tourist economy. The sacred and the commercial in the ancient Mediterranean were never separate things. Baalbek knew this. Its gods knew this. And the merchants who set up their tables in the shadow of the lion-headed rainspouts knew this best of all. Nothing great ends suddenly. Empires do not fall in an afternoon. Gods do not leave their temples in a single night. Sanctuaries that have been places of pilgrimage for 3 centuries do not close their gates because one emperor signs one document. They dim instead, slowly, the way a good oil lamp, left alone at the back of a room, dims as the oil runs down, still burning, still warm, just less. This is how Heliopolis ends. The story, in the textbook version, begins with Constantine. In 313 of the Common Era, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, the document that legalizes Christianity across the Roman Empire. Within a few decades, Christianity is not only legal, it is increasingly official. By the 380s, under the Emperor Theodosius, the old sanctuaries are being closed, their revenues redirected, their oracles silenced. At Baalbek, the effect is visible but slow. The great altar in the centre of the court stops receiving morning offerings. The smoke you watched rising into the summer air 2 sections ago, simply, one morning, is not lit. The priests are gradually unpaid. The pilgrims, over a generation, thin out. By the end of the 4th century, a Christian basilica is rising inside the walls of the great court itself. Its apse is cut directly into the ancient flagstones. Stones from the old altars are reused, quietly, in the new foundations. This is not destruction. This is recycling. Here's the thing about a sacred place changing religion. The building stays, the congregation changes, the language of the prayers changes, the God in the apse changes, but the stones remember every earlier visit. A Roman centurion who lit a lamp to Jupiter in the year 200 would, at the same hour in the year 450, find a Christian priest lighting a lamp to Christ, in a building made from the same stone, on the same flagstones, watching the same sun set behind the same mountains. The Palimpsest, again, scraped and rewritten, never quite erased. And then there are the earthquakes. The Bekaa Valley sits along a branch of the Dead Sea Transform Fault, a long, slow, grinding seam in the Earth's crust that runs from East Africa up through the Red Sea, up through the Dead Sea itself, and northward into Lebanon and Syria. The fault has, across recorded history, delivered a significant earthquake to this region roughly every 100 to 300 years, not always at Baalbek itself, but close enough and often enough that the sanctuary has lived its entire life within the rhythm of the shaking. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the rhythm begins to catch up. Several major earthquakes in 363, in 502, and most devastatingly in 551 damage the temple complex. The standing columns of the Temple of Jupiter, the ones we were walking beside 2 sections ago, start to fall, not all at once, a few in each event. The roof beams of the Temple of Bacchus crack and sag. The outer precinct walls settle into the soft alluvial soil of the valley floor. Every generation loses a little more of the original building, and at the same time, the money is thinning. The western half of the Roman Empire is collapsing across the 5th century. The eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, still holds Syria and Lebanon, but its budgets are stretched thin by Persian wars and border conflicts. There is no one, anymore, to commission a colossal new repair. There is no one to replace fallen columns with new imperial grants of Aswan granite. The stones that fall, from this point onward, mostly stay where they land. This is the slow tilt. The sanctuary is not destroyed, it is rather uncared for. By the middle of the 6th century, Heliopolis is a Christian town, with a working basilica inside the ruins of a pagan temple, and a population that has gotten used to living among collapsed columns the way a modern family might live beside a boarded-up factory. The children play in the rubble. The women hang washing across Corinthian capitals. The old men remember, vaguely, that this place used to be something else. And one night in July of 551, the ground beneath them moves again harder than it has moved in living memory. Let me take you to that night, because the way a sanctuary actually ends is not in a textbook entry. It is in 11 seconds, in the hour before dawn, on a particular summer morning, in the chest of a particular frightened man. It is the 9th of July, in the year 551 of the Common Era. It is the hour before dawn. You are a grain merchant. You are in your 40s. You have a wife, a daughter who is 11, a son who is 7, and a house, a modest 2-room stone house with a flat roof at the northern edge of what used to be called Heliopolis, and is now, more and more often, called Baalbek again. It is summer. The air at midnight was too warm indoors. So, as every summer you are sleeping on the roof, your wife is beside you. The children are on the roof too, a few paces away, under a light linen sheet. You can hear your son's breathing slow, even, the breathing of a child who is not dreaming about anything. The stars over the Bekaa are very clear tonight. You wake because the stone is moving. Not the lamp on the side table, you do not have a lamp on the roof. Not the water jug by the stairs. The whole roof, the whole house, the whole valley floor. Every stone that has been still for as long as you have been alive is, suddenly, not still. You are on your feet before you understand that you are on your feet. Your wife is already reaching for the children. The grinding hum gets lower and louder and turns into something you feel in the floor of your chest as much as in your ears. And then, across the town, a second sound begins. This one is higher, sharper. It is the sound of stone failing. You cannot see the temple complex from your roof. It is a quarter-mile to the south, behind 2 rows of buildings. But in the starlight, over the rooftops, you see a column, one of the great granite columns of the Temple of Jupiter, break. It does not topple. It snaps at the lowest drum, as if someone had taken an axe to an enormous candle. The top of the column drops straight down, through its own base, and then the whole 22-metre shaft falls, slowly, outward. You see the silhouette against the stars. You see the small cloud of dust that rises from the point where it strikes the court. You do not hear the strike itself for another half-second, because sound travels slower than light, even in a valley that is moving. The shaking lasts 11 seconds, possibly 12. No one afterwards will be able to agree. When it stops, you realize 3 things in sequence. 1. You and your wife and both children are alive. 2. There is, across the town, a rising chorus of voices, people calling names, looking for other people in the pre-dawn blue. 3. The air smells of splintered cedar and limestone dust, a smell you have never smelled before and will not forget. By first light, you are down in the street. The neighbours are out. A family 3 doors down has lost a daughter. Her uncle is carrying her out of what used to be the colonnade, and the small sound he is making is the sound you will remember most, for the rest of your life. Of this morning, someone, in one of the surviving households, is relighting a lamp. The warm yellow point of light in a doorway, just after dawn, becomes the sign of a house that is still a house. Far to the west, down on the coast at Berytus, the same earthquake has already sent a wave into the harbour. The historian Procopius, writing shortly afterwards, records the destruction there. He does not mention Heliopolis directly. He does not have to. The valley knows. The stones that would not be moved by 1,000 hands over 2 centuries have been moved by the earth itself. In 11 seconds. Dawn comes, eventually. The shaking does not come back that morning. The surviving columns remain standing. Life, somehow, resumes. But the sanctuary from this morning onward is never quite what it was. It has become something else. Something that, over the next 1,000 years, will be forgotten, renamed, rebuilt, and finally remembered again by a very different empire. In the year 636, an Arab army arrives in the Bekaa Valley. They come up from the south, out of the Syrian desert, part of the great outward expansion of the first Muslim caliphate that, within a single lifetime, will reshape every territory between Spain and Persia. The town of Heliopolis still, officially, Byzantine falls to them without a long siege. The Byzantine garrison is small, the walls are old. The population, after 300 years of Christian rule on top of 300 years of pagan Roman rule, is simply tired. The Arabs do what conquerors in this valley have always done. They take what is useful. And what is useful? In Heliopolis, in 636, is not the Temple of Jupiter. The Temple of Jupiter is a collapsed column field with a Christian basilica in the middle of it. What is useful is the podium. The great podium of the Temple of Jupiter, the one you and I have been walking across for the last hour, is, in engineering terms, a ready-made castle foundation. It is elevated, it is rectangular, it is already fortified. It has walls of the largest stones in the ancient world. Any enemy trying to besiege it would have to reckon, first, with the Trilithon itself. So the Arabs and the dynasties who follow them, Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Seljuk, Mamluk, gradually turn the sanctuary into a fortress. The great court is walled off, towers are added. The podium is surrounded by a defensive enceinte. The surviving columns of the Temple of Jupiter become corner markers for the new fortifications. Roman rainspouts, the carved lions we were looking at 2 sections ago, are built into fortress walls, mouths now facing out at a desert horizon instead of down at a worshipper's courtyard. Heliopolis becomes Baalbek, the Fortress of Baalbek. The Greek name recedes. The old Semitic name, the one the farmers always used in the market, returns. Baal is not remembered as a god anymore. The word has become just a place name, a word on a map, a set of syllables that mean this town. But it is the same syllables the grandfather of Septimius Severus would have heard if he had visited. The Palimpsest. Again, fortress written over basilica, written over temple, Arabic written over Latin, written over Greek, written over Aramaic. One location. 7 rewritings. And for most of the next 1,000 years, from roughly 650 to roughly 1,750, Baalbek is not a famous place. Let me be honest about this. Baalbek is, during these 11 centuries, a small Lebanese provincial fortress town, occasionally mentioned by travellers passing through, occasionally fought over by rival dynasties, occasionally struck by another earthquake. The Crusaders pass nearby, but never take the town. Saladin's armies winter here. A 12th century Arab geographer mentions the great stones with wonder, but also with practical admiration. He treats them the way a modern engineer treats a 19th century viaduct. Impressive. Slightly odd, not magical. Here's the thing. During these 1,000 years, people lived at Baalbek. 40 generations of them. Ordinary generations. They married and had children and grew old and died in the shadow of the standing columns. They hung their washing between them. They grazed goats in the great court. They sheltered from winter rain under the lion's head corner of the temple of Bacchus. They carried water up from Ras al-Ain every morning and evening, just as the Bronze Age villagers had done 3,000 years earlier, in a continuous, unbroken, practical habit that no one ever thought to write down. The stones during these centuries are not haunted. They are furniture. They are the local landscape. And there is a kind of quiet dignity in this, I think, because the monuments we call great are almost never great to the people who actually live beside them. To the child growing up in Baalbek in, say, the year 1400 of the Common Era Mamluk period, a Friday market, her father selling dried apricots under a colonnade whose purpose has been forgotten, these stones are simply the stones. You do not explain them to yourself. You do not wonder about the men who pulled the ropes. You lean against the Trilithon the way a modern child leans against a wall near a bus stop. The Trilithon is there. You are there. That is enough. The extraordinary, lived beside for long enough, becomes ordinary. That is how human beings survive proximity to anything too large to keep thinking about. But something else is also happening in these forgotten centuries. Something subtle. The stones are being preserved, even as they are forgotten, because the fortress walls built around them, the Mamluk repairs, the Ottoman garrisons, the modest agricultural economy, all of these keep the site occupied, and an occupied site is a site that is not quarried. Some of the great temples of the ancient world did not survive their own fame. Rome's marble was burned for lime. Greek temples were dismantled for Venetian palaces. The Parthenon became a Turkish powder magazine, and then in one terrible afternoon in 1687, a Venetian artillery target. Great buildings, left to reputation alone, tend to be stripped. Baalbek was not left to reputation alone. Baalbek was lived in, and being lived in, quietly, by people who did not know it was supposed to be famous, protected the stones from the kind of ambitious destruction that usually follows fame. The medieval carpenter who built a small room against the eastern wall of the Temple of Bacchus was not an enemy of the temple. He was its unofficial caretaker, and the small room he built leaned against the ancient stones and held them up. Let's take our time with this, because it matters. The long quiet is not a tragedy. The long quiet is what allowed the stones to reach us at all. By the middle of the 17th century, the world outside the Bekaa Valley is changing. Ottoman control is loosening in some Levantine provinces. European merchants and missionaries are pushing eastward into the eastern Mediterranean in growing numbers. French consulates open in Aleppo, in Sidon, in Damascus. Englishmen and Italians and Germans, with letters of introduction and sketchbooks, start appearing on the dusty roads between the Phoenician coast and the inland desert. And one morning, a traveller, climbing up the long dry pass from Beirut, comes over the crest of the Lebanon range and looks down, for the first time, into the Bekaa. And he sees in the middle of the valley, surrounded by a small town beside a small river, a cluster of standing columns that are taller than any columns he has ever seen in Italy, or in Greece, or at home, and he reaches into his saddlebag for his sketchbook. The sanctuary, after 1,000 years of being ordinary, is about to become famous again, not because anyone at Baalbek has done anything, because the world outside has rediscovered the habit of looking. Before Robert Wood, there were others. Let me name a few, briefly, because they deserve it. Pietro della Valle, an Italian nobleman and tireless traveller, passes through Baalbek in 1625. He is on his way home from a 12-year journey that has taken him through Constantinople, Persia, and India. He stops at the ruins. He writes a letter. He sketches roughly what he sees. His letter will be published in Rome after his death, and for the next 100 years it is the best description of Baalbek in any European language. Henry Mondrell, an English chaplain working at the Aleppo consulate, makes the journey in 1697. He writes up his trip, a journey from Aleppo to Jerusalem, at Easter A.D. 1,697 inches, careful, sober, Anglican prose. He measures, he counts, he records the number of standing columns. He is, in his way, the first European to treat Baalbek as a problem in documentation rather than a problem in theology. But the man who turns Baalbek properly into a European obsession is Robert Wood. Wood is Irish-born, Oxford-educated, and, in 1751, 34 years old. He has money, family money, somewhat, and a patron, James Dawkins, who has more. Dawkins is a young English gentleman with inherited wealth and an interest in the ancient world. Together, and with a skilled draftsman named Giovanni Battista Bora, they set out on a 2-year expedition to draw, measure, and describe the Roman ruins of the eastern Mediterranean. They spend weeks at Palmyra. They spend weeks then at Baalbek. Let me take you there. It is early October of 1751. It is late in the evening, perhaps 10 o'clock. You are in a rented room in the village of Baalbek. The room belongs, probably, to the family of a local merchant who is hosting the English party for a modest fee. Outside, the village is settling. The mountain air coming through the half-open wooden shutter is cold in a way that, in October at 1,000 meters of altitude, surprises anyone who has come up from the coast. You are Robert Wood. You are sitting at a small pine table. There is a single beeswax candle in a brass holder. The flame is perfectly still, the air indoors is not moving. On the table, laid flat, is a large folio sheet of rag paper, thick and creamy. In your right hand is a long pencil of compressed graphite in a wooden sheath. You are drawing the Trilithon. You have been up at the ruins since noon. You have walked the length of the western podium 4 times. You have measured, with a brass chain, the length of each of the 3 great stones. You have climbed onto the podium and measured their height. You have, earlier, watched Borra make a more precise architectural drawing of the western elevation. Your own drawing, now, is more atmospheric. It tries to capture what it felt like to stand beside them in the late afternoon light. Across the room, sitting on a low bench, James Dawkins is reading aloud, softly, from a Latin inscription he copied at the temple earlier in the afternoon. It is a dedicatory fragment, partly broken. The Emperor Antoninus Pius. A donor's name. A date. The Latin is elegant. Dawkins reads it the way one reads poetry. The scratch of your pencil on the rag paper is the loudest sound in the room. You do not yet know that these drawings, when you publish them 6 years later, will reshape the taste of 2 continents. You do not yet know that the book you are going to write, The Ruins of Baalbek, will sit in the libraries of every ambitious architect in Europe and in the American colonies, and will be consulted by men laying out capitals, porticos, and public buildings from Edinburgh to Philadelphia to St. Petersburg. You do not yet know that a small generation of American founders, in a country that does not yet exist, will lay their own capital out on templates derived, in part, from these pencil lines of yours. You just know that the candle is getting low, and that the line you are drawing at this moment, the line representing the junction between the first and second stones of the Trilithon, is the most satisfying line you have drawn on this entire expedition. You keep drawing. The candle burns down. Outside, a dog barks briefly somewhere in the sleeping village. It is a quiet night in the Bekaa. Wood's expedition returns to London in 1753. The Ruins of Baalbek, with Borra's architectural plates, is published in 1757. It is an immediate sensation. English country house builders commission porticos in the Baalbek manner. A generation of neoclassical architects, Robert Adam among them, treat Wood's plates as reference material for decades. And because Wood is meticulous and Borra is excellent, the plates are actually accurate, which matters. Because for the next 100 years, almost every European scholar trying to understand Baalbek works from Wood's measurements first, and verifies them against later fieldwork second. Here's the thing. The rediscovery of Baalbek in the 1750s is not a rediscovery in any profound sense. The stones have been there all along, and the local families have been living beside them for 40 generations. What the rediscovery does is translate the stones, again, into a new language, into Enlightenment, Europe's language of measurement, publication, and systematic architectural record. The Palimpsest accepts another layer. Folio pages in London, engraved plates bound in calfskin, a pencil drawing of a stone joint made by candlelight by a man in his 30s in a cold October room in 1751. By the end of the 18th century, Baalbek is on the European map again. By the middle of the 19th, the first photographs arrive. In 1898, a German archaeological expedition led by Theodor Weigand and Otto Puchstein will begin the first truly systematic excavation. After that, the French Mandate period. And after that, the modern Lebanese state, independence in 1946, the Directorate General of Antiquities, UNESCO inscription in 1984, and the century of steady, careful, professional investigation we are about to meet. Which brings us, at last, to the modern question. If we can calculate how the stones were moved, and, crucially, if we can name the people who did the calculating, then we can finally face, directly, the one part of this story we have been politely circling around all night. Because alongside the modern scholarship, there has grown, in parallel, a very different kind of storytelling. And it is time to meet both. Modern archaeology at Baalbek begins, properly, in 1898. In the autumn of that year, a German expedition under Theodor Weigand and Otto Puchstein arrives in the Bekaa, with imperial funding from Kaiser Wilhelm II. They will spend, across several seasons, the better part of the next 7 years at the site. They will clear debris from the Great Court. They will measure the Trilithon with instruments more precise than anything Wood had. They will catalogue inscriptions. They will publish, between 1921 and 1925, a 6-volume German report that remains, a century later, one of the foundation documents of Baalbek studies. After the First World War, the site passes under the French Mandate, and French archaeologists continue the work through the 1920s and 1930s. Then, Lebanese independence in 1946. The Lebanese Directorate General of Antiquities takes over. Through the 1950s, the 1960s, the terrible civil war years from 1975 to 1990, and then into the fragile peace afterwards, professional archaeology at Baalbek does not stop. It slows at times. It is careful, sometimes too careful, but it does not stop. UNESCO inscribes Baalbek as a World Heritage Site in 1984. Alongside the fieldwork, there grows a specialized discipline, the ancient engineering subfield that asks, systematically and quantitatively, how were large ancient stones actually moved and lifted? This is a discipline with its own journals, its own conferences, its own equations. It is not mystical, it is not dramatic, it is patient. And one of its quiet practitioners is a French archaeologist named Jean-Pierre Adam. Let me take you to a specific evening. The date is not important. It is winter. It is the early 1990s. It is past midnight. You are Jean-Pierre Adam. You are in your study in Paris. Your desk is old oak, and covered in the mild disorder of a working scholar with books, off-prints, and a half-rolled architectural drawing you have been trying to finish for 3 days. In front of you is a large sheet of graph paper. A reading lamp, green-shaded brass, throws a warm yellow pool across the paper. You are drawing, by hand, in pencil, a diagram of a sledge on a prepared wooden track. Underneath the sledge, you have drawn a rectangle representing a limestone block, 20 meters long, 250 cubic meters, approximately 800 tons. You have drawn, ahead of the sledge, a small human figure pouring a thin line of water onto the sand beneath the runners. You have written, in the margin, in neat architect's capitals, mum, dry, is approximately equal to 0.6, mum, wet, is approximately equal to 0.2, gain, is approximately equal to 3x. You are calculating how many men, through how many capstans, with how many pulleys, for how many working weeks, would be required to move this block the 800 meters from quarry to podium. The answer you are converging on, tonight, is roughly this. A standing workforce of 1,200 trained hands, coordinated through 40 capstan stations, operating through one favourable post-harvest season of approximately 14 weeks, at a typical advance of 2 to 3 meters per working day, with seasonal pauses for weather. The calculation is not clean. It has uncertainties. You note them honestly in the margin. What it is not is impossible. There is, beside the paper, a small cup of tea. It has gone cold. You have not noticed. Your wife, asleep in the next room, will find the cup in the morning and smile without saying anything. You finish the diagram around 2 a.m. You write, in the margin, the bibliographic citation, cf. Ruprechtberger 1999, vom Steinbruch zum Jupitertempel. You switch off the reading lamp. The warm yellow pool disappears. The paper, the pencil, the calculation remain on the desk, waiting to become, in a few years' time, an illustration in a peer-reviewed journal and, in a few more, a paragraph in a scholarly book. This is what the rebuttal to ancient alien speculation about Baalbek actually looks like. It does not look like a debate. It looks like a cold cup of tea at 2 a.m. beside a piece of graph paper in a quiet Paris study. And because Adam's calculation exists and the work of Ruprechtberger and of a dozen other modern engineers, we can, now, speak directly to 4 specific claims that have circulated in the public imagination about Baalbek. Each of these claims is attached to a specific person or to a specific meme. Each of them deserves a calm, single-sentence answer. Let's go in order. First, Graham Hancock, in several popular books, has suggested that the foundations of Baalbek, and specifically the lowest courses of the podium, are the work of a lost, pre-Ice Age civilization that predates all known history by many thousands of years. The rebuttal, from the archaeological record, is simple. No stratigraphy below the Roman podium shows any megalithic construction earlier than the late Hellenistic period. Adam documents this in his 1977 monograph. Ruprechtberger confirms it in 1999. Where pre-Roman stone does exist at Baalbek, it is modest, locally cut, and consistent with ordinary Bronze Age and Iron Age provincial sanctuary work. There is no lost civilization under the temple. There is only an older, smaller, more human sanctuary. Second, Eric von Daniken, in the book Chariots of the Gods and in several follow-up works, suggested that Baalbek was built, or at least its larger stones placed by ancient astronauts, possibly as a spaceport. The rebuttal, again, is the tool marks. The surface of every block in the podium, and of every block in the quarry, carries the signature of iron-tipped and bronze-tipped hand tools used at angles and rhythms consistent with recorded Roman and pre-Roman quarry practice from the eastern Mediterranean. We are not inferring this. We are looking at the marks. There is no anomalous technology on the stones of Baalbek. There are the marks of human chisels, held by human hands, swung at human speeds. Third, Zechariah Sitchin, in a series of books now best known through internet summaries, argued that the Great Podium of Baalbek was a landing and launching platform for the Anunnaki, a group of alleged ancient Mesopotamian astronaut gods. The rebuttal is Adam's calculation itself. Sitchin's argument rests on the premise that no human civilization could have moved blocks of this size. Adam shows, quietly, with friction coefficients and capstan mechanics, that a Roman-era workforce plausibly could. Once the impossibility dissolves, the Anunnaki hypothesis has nothing to explain. Fourth, more recently, an internet meme has circulated suggesting that Baalbek is the platform from which the Nephilim, the pre-flood giants of the Book of Enoch, ascended and descended. The rebuttal has two parts. 1. No textual source earlier than 20th century fringe literature links the Nephilim to Baalbek in any way. The Book of Enoch, composed between the 3rd century before our era and the 1st century of our era, does not mention Baalbek. 2. The Nephilim, in their original Jewish apocalyptic context, are a moral category fallen beings whose corruption justifies the flood. They are not engineers. They are not launching anything. The meme is a contemporary invention with no ancient textual anchor. Here's the thing about this section. You may notice I am not mocking any of these writers. I am not calling them names. I am treating each claim with the same calm, single-sentence rebuttal from the same body of evidence. That is deliberate, because honest scholarship does not mock. Honest scholarship admits interpretive gaps, describes the evidence, names the sources, and lets the readers draw conclusions. What honest scholarship does not do is fill the interpretive gaps with aliens. There is, in fact, a difference, a real and important difference between we don't know and we can't say. Scholars at Baalbek are comfortable, even routinely, saying we don't know about specific things, the exact date of the lowest podium course, the specific identity of the final builders of the Trilithon, the precise number of labourers at peak. What they do not say, and what the fringe writers routinely say, is that therefore the answer must be extraordinary. The fringe move is to turn we don't know into we can't say, into therefore aliens. Each of those steps is wrong. The first is a statement of honest humility. The second is a misrepresentation. The third is a conjuration. Adam's cold cup of tea, at 2 a.m, beside the graph paper that is the opposite of a conjuration. That is the patient, unglamorous, cumulative work of answering a hard question with a hard calculation on a winter night in a quiet study by a man whose name is on the paper, whose sources are cited, and whose numbers can be checked. That, in the end, is what human hands at the edge of the possible actually looks like in antiquity and again in our own time. The Roman workers pulled the ropes, Adam did the friction calculations. The answer to how was Baalbek built is written in both sets of handwriting. Not aliens, humans, both the ones who hauled the stones and the ones who, 2,000 years later, worked out how they hauled them. So, that is the answer to the question the title of this video asks. Mostly. Because there is one more piece to speak about honestly, one last set of questions that the modern scholarship, despite all its patience, has not yet resolved. And it would not be right, tonight, to pretend otherwise. Let's sit with the genuinely unresolved for just a few minutes before we begin to close. Let me, briefly and honestly, name what we still do not know. The lowest courses of the podium, what archaeologists call the U-layer, the blocks underneath the great retaining wall that contains the Trilithon itself, have been a matter of careful, unresolved scholarly discussion for the better part of a century. The dominant working hypothesis, based on careful fieldwork and ceramic association, places these courses in the late Hellenistic or earliest Roman period. But the dating is ambiguous. The context is disturbed. Honest scholars have proposed more than once that at least some of these lowest blocks could be earlier. How much earlier is not clear. That remains, quietly, an open technical question. We also do not fully know whether there was, before the Roman temple complex, an earlier monumental platform on this site, a Hellenistic or even a Phoenician period terrace. The site has been continuously occupied and heavily overbuilt, and below a certain depth, further excavation risks damaging standing structures. So there is a boundary in the archaeology, below which the direct evidence thins out and becomes, again, fragmentary. This is the honest ending. Not every question gets an answer. Some stones, quietly, keep their secret. And I want to say, gently, that this is not an invitation for aliens to walk back into the story. The unresolved questions at Baalbek are not mysterious in the supernatural sense. They are unresolved in the ordinary, difficult, decade-by-decade sense that all archaeology is unresolved. They will be slowly closed or slowly clarified by future fieldwork, future dating techniques, future patient labour of people we will never meet. There is no hurry. These stones have waited 18 centuries to be cleanly dated. They will wait one more. They are, in this respect at least, very patient. And in that patience, in the willingness of good scholarship to say, out loud, we do not know yet, but we will keep looking, is something that is, I think, rarer than either certainty or conspiracy. It is the honest middle voice of human learning. It has been the voice of this whole video. So, we have done most of what we came to do tonight. The stones are here. We have stood beside them. We have walked the quarry, pulled the rope, watched the empires arrive and leave, and met the modern scholars. What remains is to ask, briefly and softly, why any of it matters to us, now and then to say good night. Here's the thing about a mystery that lasts 2,000 years. It is not a failure of knowledge. It is not a gap to be embarrassed about. It is, if you sit with it for long enough, something closer to a gift. Modern engineers, when they visit Baalbek, and many of them do, quietly, without fanfare, usually on their own holiday time, tend to come away from the site with the same small, stubborn feeling. It is not the feeling of how did they do this. That question, as we have seen tonight, has answers, perfectly good answers. Friction, capstans, cribbing, seasons, patience, a short downhill haul, 1,000 tired pairs of hands. The feeling is, instead, something closer to. We have forgotten how patient our ancestors were willing to be. A modern construction project measured in months. A Roman imperial project measured in generations. A modern crane that lifts 200 tons in an afternoon. A Roman cribbing tower that lifts the same block in 90 days. A modern worker who expects to finish what he started. A Roman quarryman whose grandson might, if the seasons held, see the last stone laid. This is not a romantic comparison. It is a mathematical one. Patience, across enough human beings, is its own kind of engine, and when that engine has access to rope, wood, water, lubricant, and a favourable geology, it can over long enough move a small mountain. There is a useful distinction, here, that honest scholars have been quietly insisting on for 100 years. There is a difference between unsolved and unsolvable. We do not have every answer about Baalbek. The lowest courses of the podium, the so-called U-layer stones, may or may not predate the Roman build. The precise sequence of the Trilithon's final placement is reconstructed from inference, not from a surviving engineering diary. The exact labour counts, the exact seasons, the name of the engineer who signed off on the western wall, these we do not have, and may never have. That is unsolved. It is not unsolvable. It is not impossible. It is, in the most ordinary and most human sense, simply lost to time the way most of what any of us do will eventually be lost to time. There's still no rush, by the way. Take a slow breath. The stones aren't going anywhere. They have waited 2,000 years for your attention tonight. They can wait a few more seconds. What Baalbek leaves us with in the end is not a puzzle. It is an invitation to respect the humans who did this, to believe, a little more generously, in what ordinary patience can accomplish, and to understand that the grander answer, the stranger answer, is not that aliens came down to a Lebanese valley The grander answer is that we did this. Our species, with its tired shoulders and its brothers-in-law and its coughs and its grief and its bread baking in the evening, we built a temple to the gods on a foundation of our own astonishing patience. And the gods, apparently, recognized the address. There is one more thing to say, before we let the night carry us the rest of the way, because Baalbek is not a place in the past. It is a place, right now, tonight, with lights on and people living in it, and a festival that has returned to the ruins since the 1950s. Let me take you there briefly before we sleep. It is a warm evening in July, in the Bekaa, in our own century. Inside the great court of the Temple of Jupiter, the same court where Septimius Severus stood in a purple-edged toga 1800 years ago, the same court where a Christian basilica later rose, the same court where a grain merchant's lamp was relit at dawn after the earthquake of 551, a temporary stage has been set up between the columns. The audience sits in folding chairs on the ancient flagstones. Some of them are local, many are from abroad. The evening air is cool. The stars above the Bekaa are, as they have always been, unusually clear. This is the Baalbek International Festival. It has been held almost every summer in these ruins since 1956. Ella Fitzgerald sang here. Fayrouz, the great Lebanese voice of the 20th century, sang here many times. And her voice in these stones is still, for a great many Arab listeners, the sound of the country itself. Joan Baez sang here. Orchestras from Vienna and from Cairo have played here. The stones that 1,000 tired hands hauled into place in the 1st century, that a candle-lit Robert Wood sketched in 1751, that a French archaeologist's pencil diagrammed in the 1980s now, for 2 weeks every summer, amplify music written in a language none of the original builders would have recognized, for an audience that includes people who flew in from Sao Paulo and from Seoul. In 1984, UNESCO inscribed Baalbek on the World Heritage List. The Lebanese Directorate General of Antiquities, across war and peace and every political complication the last decades have brought to this region, has kept the site open. The families who have lived here for 40 generations still live here. Children still play between the columns. The stones are still here, the people are still here, the mystery is still here, that's the gift. And now, gently, the night is long enough. Let me bring you home. Septimius Severus is long dead. Robert Wood is long dead. Jean-Pierre Adam, last we heard, was still working, somewhere in France on another patient drawing. The man whose hands were on the rope in the 4th hour of the hall, whose name none of us will ever know, is long, long dead. But the stones remember everyone who touched them. Mysteries that survive 2,000 years are not failures of knowledge. They are invitations to respect the humans who made them. Somewhere in your ancestry, on some line, in some century, is a person who hauled something impossible because someone asked them to. A wall, a roof beam, a harvest, a child up a hill in the snow. You are here because they did not stop pulling. Tonight, wherever they are resting too. The stones are here. The wind moves across the podium. Sleep well wherever you are.